Good. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a totally different talk. This is new material, which in this version I have not presented before. I presented a different version a few months ago. This is a totally new version. In fact, I'm presenting it precisely because it's unfinished work. It's a long-term project, it's unfinished, so I absolutely welcome comments and suggestions. In fact, we were just exchanging emails with Greg Clark and Denis Sergenka just yesterday. So a lot of work is still being calculated as we speak. I will explain why this is a long-term project with at least 3 or 4 papers that we plan out of this. But, so, this talk, the people who have been working on it, I just put a lot of people who have been working on it, including, so the main scholars are me and Greg Clark of UC Davis, and then Maxim Bruyhanov, Pavel Derkachov, Polyachenko, Vasily Rukhanov, Denis Sergenka, and also Zhenya here has been working on it also, on this helping with us. So it's a gigantic project. Anna Panova have different pieces. But you'll see why it's a giant project, and we have multiple papers we hope to come out of this. Okay, let's begin. The big question that we want to ask is, how persistent are social groups? Or another way of saying it, how do we really get at the issue of social mobility? This is work that's based upon the work of Greg Clark. I'll come to this. But first, I want to emphasize what we really want to do is we want to look at different groups of social, intellectual, and business elites over time who are overrepresented in the population. That is to sort of say they are somehow overrepresented in some elite occupation, whether it's at a university, whether it's being a general, whether it's being a politician, relative to the percentage of people of similar family names in the whole group. Part of the motivation for this is the fact that most measures of social mobility have been very limited. They tend to focus on income, and they tend to look at specific families. Those are 2 big problems because, the second one first, the biggest problem is that you get a severe regression to mean problem. If you look at one group, one family, one of the problems you get is you have a selection bias. You will overestimate social mobility because, let us say you look at a billionaire family, and you look 3 or 4 generations down the line. It is very unlikely that the second generation of a billionaire family is going to be more successful than the first generation. But what you will also not see are the people who are related to the billionaire who actually had been low in social status, even though, say, their grandfather's been high, who come back up. So what you really need to get a fair estimate is some notion. What you really want is something like the following. Is this, imagine that there are 10 brothers of a family that doesn't exist. It's like completely rare name. There are 10 brothers who start out at high levels. And then you can observe the 10 brothers and all their families, their great-grandchildren, move up and down. We do not have that. So the question is, how do we look at this problem knowing that we cannot perfectly follow individual families in a truly random assignment? And that's what we're going to get at in a second. Before I explain what we do, the second thing to point out is that if you think about even what happens today in most countries, elites tend to be good at pushing their children and grandchildren into elite occupations, not necessarily for wealth, right? So the founder of the family may be, say, a billionaire, but the children might include lawyers, doctors, engineers, professors. Some might run for public office. Some might go into Hollywood. So if you look only at income, you're ignoring the ways in which persistence of elite status matters. Okay, so part of the motivation for doing this is to try to understand how mobile groups are from the top, but also ideally you will be symmetric. You need to look at how mobile underrepresented groups are, right? Because if you have rapid social mobility, so one of the hardest things to do is to look at, say, very poor or very unsuccessful families. And then, in theory, if there's social mobility, over time they will drift to the average. But if you think about it, it's very hard to do that most history is history of the elites. Almost everything we know that's directly historical tends to be about either elite families, literate families, families that something important happened to, whether it's bad or good. But the real ordinary people tend to be forgotten, except at most in some senses. So that almost by definition, our look at what happens to these things is almost always focused on the top. We're using a technique which we believe is better at picking up broader trends for both the top and the bottom, but at the same time losing some specificity. And so let me explain how this works. So generally there are three assumptions. That is to sort of say some particular status, say educational, is normally distributed. Their elite surname types are normal distributed but with a higher mean. So one way you can think about it is that, let's make something up. So for Russia, I think the most common name is Ivanov. The most common surname is Ivanov. On the other hand, imagine that there's some more elite name like Verlinsky. It doesn't mean that all who are Verlinskys are, say, an elite family or noble family. It just means that Verlinsky is, the elite part is a higher share of the total names of those who are Verlinskys. Now, over time, some Verlinskys will change names, especially daughters and so forth. They will marry somebody else. Some may change their names for political reasons. Conversely, some non-elites will change their name to Berlinsky. But what that should do is introduce noise. So long as the elite part is a substantial portion of that whole group, you should observe some kind of pattern. If you, despite all the noise, despite outmigration, changing names, you still see a statistically significant pattern that's different, that's a fortiori a stronger proof of some degree of persistence. That's the argument that's being made here, but I'll explain this more. This technique was pioneered by Greg Clark, who has agreed to be a co-author in this. Greg has a book, which I strongly recommend, titled The Sun Also Rises. The Sun with S-O-N. For Greg likes Hemingway puns. His first book was A Farewell to Alms, and the second one is The Sun Also Rises. But I strongly recommend you look at The Sun. And here's what Greg has done. He basically has looked for England, because England has a lot of determinants. So a very good example is to think about this way. Think about the distribution of social status. Let's say this is education. And let's say Oxford is at the top, has been at the top of the English education pyramid for hundreds of years. So basically what happens is elite surnames will be overrepresented, say in, say, Oxford. Say this green line determines who gets into Oxford. And non-elite surnames will be underrepresented. Right? So what you want to do is you want to observe this overrepresentation at some earlier point in time. And then ask, after so many years, how does it move towards this mean? And from that, you can calculate a generational, where generation is defined as 25 or 30 years. For the sake of this paper, we'll say 30 years. Every generation, how big is the implied mobility? You understand? And so that's really, that's what it boils down to. That's most of what our technique is about. But I'm going to talk about how this is going to be relevant from Russia, and then I'm going to discuss the challenges of the data. What's the limitations of our data, and what are the problems we have, and what we're still trying to get data on. But notice, if you believe this, that this is a good technique, it allows you to observe social mobility at a much broader rate than ever before. And in Greg's book, one of the things that was surprising for Greg's work was that studying the US, the UK, and Sweden over several hundred years, contrary to what you would expect, social mobility was lower than income social mobility studies. And social mobility was virtually the same in all three countries, which would be shocking because you think of Sweden as becoming very egalitarian. But in fact, if you start thinking not about money, because Sweden has very high personal income tax, but about elite status, which is things like who becomes the doctors and lawyers, who goes to top universities, who is in the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, it turns out that's quite elite. A very good example. So Greg focuses on, he has the best data for England, because England has name data for the whole population going back hundreds of years because of parish data. But you have fairly good data for the northeast of the United States. So let's just compare Oxford and Cambridge with the Ivy League. So it turns out, for Oxford and Cambridge, he can calculate every 100 years how any group of elite declines, how fast it declines relative to the average. And I think he has a generational persistence of like 0.73, 0.75. That means there's a decline of 1/4 in overrepresentation every generation. And it never fully declines, or it's asymptotes, right? here's the striking thing. Not only is it low mobility in Oxford and Cambridge, but in the US Ivy League schools, which are 8 schools, the word Ivy League is often misused by foreigners. Ivy League does not mean a top school. So MIT and Stanford are not Ivy League universities. Ivy League is actually a football conference, which involves 8 elite schools: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, Columbia, Dartmouth, Cornell. And Yale. Those are the 8. Those are the 8. And Brown. Those are the 8. Those 8 schools were the Ivy League, the original Ivy League. And interestingly enough, if you look at rare Northeastern names, I guess it might be like Vanderbilt or something like rare Northeastern names, it turns out the decline in rare Northeastern names in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. today is about the same as the persistence in Oxford and Cambridge, despite the fact that at that time, almost all the students of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. were all from the Northeast. And there were no women, and no minorities, or almost no blacks. And yet, despite those changes, the elite Northeasterners are still overrepresented in the Ivy League today, just at a lower rate. And then, interestingly enough, he found the same thing with the Royal Swedish Academy. So it's very interesting, it turns out, so Swedes used to be the case like Iceland today. Icelanders mostly don't have family names unless they're descended from noble families. Icelanders' name is just like, it changes, right? It's like a patronymic. So if your father's name Jon, you are Jonsson, but if you're a girl, you're Jon's daughter, right? So Sweden comes from that. So Andersson literally meant Anders' son. So if Anders had a son named Jon, his son would be named Jonsson. But afterwards, that name in Sweden got frozen as a family name. There are elite family names, nobles, but they were outlawed. No new noble names were created after 1800. So it's a very limited sample of noble names. However, there's one group of elites that created new family names. Can you guess which one? The first generation to go to university in Sweden invented their own family names. They made family names out of Latin words. And it turns out those people are heavily overrepresented in today's elites. What are those names? Like in the Royal Swedish Academy, some names are 10 times overrepresented population. What are the names? Names like, Linnaeus, Celsius. These kinds, when you hear those kinds of names, these are people descended from the first generation of Swedes who went to university. And those are a big part of the social, political, and intellectual elite of Sweden today. Even surprisingly, Greg Clark did studies for China from before the war to after the Deng Xiaoping. And Beijing University, so China is very unusual too, because most of China has only a few surnames. They actually talk about 100 surnames. It's more than that, but it turns out a limited number of surnames accounts for most of Chinese population. But there are a few surnames that are rarer. Mine is pretty rare, but not super rare. So I'm Ni, but not, with Ni is Ran or the Ni for you. And Ni is like, Ran, So Ni, and anyway, but there are some that are even rarer. It turns out if you look at rare surnames in Beijing University, the rate of decline, even after the Cultural Revolution, is almost exactly the same as in Oxford and Cambridge. So you see this persistence. So now so the question we want to care about is we want to say, so I'll skip this next picture. It's the same idea. It shows you the intergenerational correlation in Oxbridge from 1800 to 2014, okay? And basically, Greg Clark did this using Oxford, and he has mobility typically 0.7 to 0.8. And you have a very high social stability. We're going to do this for Russia. That's our goal. Russia has very special challenges. We don't have as good data as England, but we have other things that are better. One more interesting fact from England is that the Parliament, you would think, would have rapid change. Why? Because at one time, Parliament was only House of Lords. And then overnight, they created the House of Commons. So half of Parliament were non-noble. So you should have changed mobility, right? No. It turns out most of the leaders of the House of Commons were related distantly to those in the House of Lords. So what you often see this, that even disgraced families or whatnot are like third, fourth generation, 5 cousins removed from many of the people in the elites. And you see this, that's why a big debate is how much of this persistence is genetic and how much of the persistence is social and cultural connections. That is something we cannot say about in this study at the moment. Although Greg is looking at different tests to separate out how much is more likely to be biological or genetic and how much is likely to be social and cultural connections. But that's a separate issue we're not getting into here. If Greg has been here already a couple of times at HSC, and we are trying to organize, I think we're going to be in a panel at the Gaidar Forum in January, where both Greg Clark and I will talk. I will probably talk about Russia, and Greg will talk about, I think, his overall research project, which includes England, but also Hungary and China and many other countries. Okay, so if we think about elite groups, what we're really going to look for is the elite persistence of the nobility or the most overrepresented nobility, right? So remember, in all of these things, one of the things you have to clear from your mind is your idea of a specific elite. It would be better if you don't think about the word elite, maybe to understand what we're doing, think about overrepresented groups, right? A group may be noble but not overrepresented. What we want is groups that are overrepresented in some elite outcome, whether it's political or educational or social, whatever. So among the groups that tended to be overrepresented in 19th century Russia were the nobility, Jews, Germans, and other successful elites. All right? And in particular, Jews and Germans were heavily concentrated in the wealthy urban regions, and they tended to overlap. For example, if you look at the Russian ministers of finance and economics in the 19th century, they had very Russian names like Bunge, Witte, Kankrin, Reutern. Sound very Russian, don't they? Right? If you listen to the name Stolypin, right, the one that's more like the purest Russian name is probably Vishnegradsky, which it turns out for various reasons, ski is not all that Russian because it overlaps heavily with the Polish nobility. So if you think about it, if you look at that, Russia has all these famous finance ministers, the majority of whom have Germanic names. Or non-common. So you are well aware of this persistence. Similarly, Jews supposedly have a special status, and that at various times they were discriminated against by leading universities, and it changes back and forth. That's part of what we're going to look at as well. Okay? So what are our data? So we already updated. This is different. We have data for Moscow State for 1885, 1910, 1920, 1913, 2013. We're going to try to add more years before the revolution and more recent years. 1910 data is very interesting because it has the entire entering class. It actually lists religion and social background. Like we'd actually sort of say noble, you will say Jew, you will say Polish, you will sort of say tradesman. So we have certain types of data like this for 1910. So you see among the examples, noble, peasant, merchant, government official, doctor, colonel. The 1920 is more limited. It's only social sciences. In 1930, we only have literature. It's very hard. It's getting very hard for us to find good data from the Stalin years. And from, so we may have to like focus heavily on the Soviet years of the 60s, 70s, 80s. Okay? What do we use? Here's the biggest problem you have. You have to get data on the general distribution of the names in the population. That turns out to be the hardest thing for Russia. Apparently, Russians never had a full census representative of the entire population by names. England, you can get a names distribution for virtually every decade going back 500 years. And Greg has done that. Certainly every century he's got several observations. For Russia, I can't even get a giant hospital which is representative. It'll turn out our names list depends upon two groups. One is Kontakte. At the moment, we have a sample of 2 million people from the Moscow and Moscow region. But we are getting another sample of another 2.5 million people from outside of the Moscow region. So that, now the problem even Kontakte is that it's fairly representative, but it's still slightly elite biased. Because the mere fact that you have a computer or you're using your phone for this and you use social media means you're not on the very bottom. The other sample we have, which is more close to a true sample, is prisoners killed in World War II. Which if you look at it, you can see it's less elite and it's more, and we're going to assume that that's the most non-elite sample we have, but we'll check everything, both using Kontakte data and that people killed in World War II. We'll also have a separate prisoners list we're trying to compile, which will also be non-elite for prisoners by the Germans in World War II. So that's the best we can have. If somebody can give us a place where we can get like something like 500,000 names or even 100,000 names for the 19th century that's really general, it's not biased. Because we have things like Vsia Moskva and Vsia Peterburg, which are a list of people who are registered housing, but that's super elite. Right? These are people with property and things of that sort, so that's super elite for 1910 and 1905. So you see Russians compared to every other country, it's very strange. Compared to the US, China, they don't seem to have lists of ordinary people. Guess, I don't know.
They don't matter.
I understand. But I always thought the Chinese were more like that than the Russians, but it turns out China has better data than Russia does on ordinary people. Okay, like I sort of said, we're going to look, so for the sake of this paper, just to simplify, we haven't done all our work yet. One way we're going to look at the first cut to show you some of our results is that we haven't had time to look at names in detail. So one way to get some early results is to look just at name endings. Because some name endings are more overrepresented than others. So for example, if you think of name endings like ov, yev, in, ko, uch, ich, ski, ski tends to be more elite than ov, ev names. So Lebedev and Ivanov are less elite than, Palinsky, Velinsky. Partly this is related to Polish nobility, even though Poland, of course, was separated from the Russian Empire, but there's still this persistence of ski as being a somewhat more elite name. On average, right? It could be like 90% of it is not elite, but there's a 10% overrepresentation. And like I sort of said, if you look at ski names, they are only moderately elite because they are 3 times overrepresented in Moscow State. What does 3 times mean? If you look at the percentage of skis in the general population, like our prisoner data, there are 3 times as many people with ski names in Moscow State as in the prisoners' data. But in other names are like only exactly proportional or even less than proportional. That's what we mean by elite. We're going to look at some outcome. Most of this will be about Moscow State, but we will also have a generals list, Duma list, chess players, etc. We'll talk about this. We use Moscow State because it has been one of the elite universities since its beginning. You could make the argument in the 19th century, Petersburg State was more elite because Petersburg was the center. Still, Moscow State and Peter were the 2 leading universities. Today, it remains among the leading universities, although measured by YEGE scores or USE scores, it's only number 6. HSC is in the top 5. Right? So later on, you'll see we're going to look at data not just from Moscow State, but the top 6 universities. There's the top 5 plus Moscow State. So by 1860, there were 1,500 students in Moscow State, which is comparable to Oxford at 2,500. And then there were many changes after the revolution, including free tuition and living costs. The other interesting thing is that the major beneficiaries were the Jews. There were many restrictions against Jews in Moscow State, but because Jews were associated with the Bolshevik Revolution, they removed those restrictions and allowed Jews, so Jewish numbers skyrocketed in early Moscow State. But then Stalin comes and becomes anti-Jewish, and the Jewish numbers go back down. So you see some of these ups and downs, all right? But today you have about over 5,000 people in Moscow State per year. Right, so just give you an example, if you look at common Russian names, they are approximately 3/4 of the general population. But in Moscow State in 1910, they're only 65% of Moscow State. And interestingly enough, after the revolution, they decline. So common names actually decline after the revolution. Ski names are 4% of the general population. There's 17% of Moscow State in 1910, but they declined to 12%. A lot of that decline is because Poland separates. And then if you look at German Jewish names, they're 1% of the population, but they're 5% of Moscow State in 1910, and they jump up to 13% in 1920. Which is what you would sort of, so you see this is what we mean by overrepresentation. And we want to look at these sets of names, and then see for those specific names how they've declined over time. If we look at 1910, 1920, 1930, you see that common Russian names decline and then go back by 1930. And in contrast, elite Russian names still stay high, but they go down from a high of 17%. German Jewish names go up and then down.
Excuse me, why doesn't they are very tiny, right? Like 0, 0, 0.
Yeah, something like that. And these are over-representation, right? Why doesn't sum up to 100, right? Yeah, we're not including all the other names that are not. These are the most common Russian names, and we're not including other elite names, noble names, etc.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
I'm just giving you an example of some of these things. If we look at Ski Skaya, the general population of Ski is 4%, it's 17% Moscow State. Notice by 2013, the ski names are exactly average. So that's full convergence. The ski names have converged to the general population. Okay? Interestingly enough, we looked at the nobility names. The nobility are mostly not represented in Moscow State. So apparently the nobility didn't like to go to university. That's why we're going to look at generals. And so you don't look at the big list of noble names. Nobles as a whole are not overrepresented, but some nobles are. So we're going to look at the subset of nobles who tend to be overrepresented in certain things. Like I said, we're using endings as a first cut to understand why this is. The Russian names are generally noble according to Unbegaun. And a name could be a Polish ending, but it could also originate from Ukraine, where it's not aristocratic. And Ski-Skaya names were used by the theological colleges to give names to newly coming students, typically adding the ending to the name with the biblical ending. So Rождественство, Christmas could lead to a name like Rождественский. So this is like you sort of see the name is a mix of elite and non-elite names. Okay? And as I sort of said, I've showed you how they've declined in Moscow State. Generally, ovals are not overrepresented. And looking at nobles today, they're about average in the population. So I think for nobles, we may have to look at the generals list, because nobles are not very big on going to university, I guess. Unlike every other country, right? Unlike Sweden, the United States, UK, China, where nobility tend to be massively overrepresented. Just a second, yes? You wanted to ask a question about this?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear you.
Yeah, later, let's just do it. If you look at Russian parliament, for example, this is 1912, and we're including the Soviet parliament here. 1912, 38, 67, 93, Duma, 2016. The noble names go from 2% to 1%. Ski-Skaya go from 3 not percent, overrepresentation. Ski-Skaya is overrepresented by 3.5, but now it's back down to the average. German Jewish are still overrepresented in today's Duma. And the most common surnames go up. The 5 most common surnames go up, and they're heavily overrepresented in the modern Duma today. No, those are overrepresentation rates. Times, right? How much are they overrepresented relative to their percentage in the population? So 3 means if they are 2% in the population, they have 6%. And if you look at it, I said most groups from MSU pre-revolution aren't elite today. Now we have very limited information, but the shocking thing about this is that if this turns out to be true, this makes Russia the most socially mobile country that we've ever studied. That it seems like the revolution mattered. Maybe. It turns out we will be looking at the wrong data for some reason. We'll come to it. One thing that we have that no other country has, which was shocking to us, is we have for 6 years, from 1911 to 1916, we have 90% to 100% in some years of all Russian colleges and universities and their entire entering class. We have their names and their YEGE scores, their USE scores. So unlike in the US, it will be impossible to get this data. We can actually calculate the mean USE score of someone with a name, like with a given name, in a university, and we can calculate the standard deviation of those names. So for example, if you look at many of the groups, mean USE scores for 2011 of all students was 62. This is averaging all those tests they give. They don't give us individual tests, they just average it. And the average of all Jewish and German is 62 also. However, if you look only at Jewish and German from Moscow State 1885, top 100, you get a 64 YEGE average, with the minimum being 40, whereas the minimum is more 28 for the general population. If you look at the groups that were in both 1885 and 1910, so the names, then their YEGE average is 69.6. But the problem is this is a very small sample of only 14 people. So we're going to look at things like Wikipedia, all Russian scientists mentioned in Wikipedia, all Russian writers, all musicians, things of that sort. We're also looking today at the top 1,000 Russian scholars in math, physics, and biology, ranked by foreign citations. And we're going to compare names from Wikipedia in the 19th century to these names today, as well as the German Jewish. So you notice that even though the samples are small, the more selective the sets of names, the higher the average today. Right? And that what we're trying to find is to get these large enough so you get statistical significance. If, on the other hand, you just look at the most overrepresented top 25, regardless of whether Jewish, German, or from, it's a bit above average, but only a little bit. Right? It's only 33 names in Moscow State today. Like I said, I don't have time to go through all of them. This one you don't need to see. You just notice that almost all the ski, of, yev, in co-endings are like 62 plus or minus 1. So they're very high regression to the mean. Alternative check, we look at chess rankings, and there you see heavy representation of Jewish and German elites from the Russian, because Masters and Grossmeister. And the good thing about chess is it has a Bayesian rating system, so it's possible to compare over time, and you can do the relative ranking. And we can look at that. And YEGE scores. This is what we have, like just different from everybody else. What are the conclusions? Compared to other countries, it seems that the Soviet Union had much bigger mobility effect than any other revolution. And think about it, because the Chinese Revolution, the Great Famine, the out-migration of many elites because of Chiang Kai-shek and to the United States and Hong Kong, as well as the Cultural Revolution, should have shaken things up. But you don't see a big effect in terms of enrollment at Beijing University, which was quite surprising. Whereas in Russia, you tend to see a lot. The interesting thing about Russia is what we're seeing is there's a return to trend after 91. For example, if you look at German and Jewish names, what it looks like between 1920 and 1990 is it kind of bumps up and down like this. But if you ignore the Soviet period and just draw a line, it looks more like US or UK, just a little faster. So it's kind of interesting. So we want to verify if, in fact, the Soviets really did increase mobility, or was there just disruption and everything is now returning to trend? All right. One of the other things we're looking at by looking at Russian scientists, we're going to look at the early 90s and we're going to look at today. We know that there's a large out-migration of many top scientists from Russia. The interesting thing is, are they replaced by people with similar name endings? Or does the whole list of scholars become more or less elite and more proletariat? Right? Because if they're just replaced by the same, then it really tells you these overall name distributions are really important. And so when one group leaves, they're replaced by other elites kind of similar families. Or are they replaced by more proletarian names? That's one of the things we can see. And then are they different for math or physics or biology? Right? So in certain, both genetics and culture may matter more in some areas than others. And the other thing that's interesting is the 5 most common surnames are not the true average, because the 5 most common surnames tend to be somewhat overrepresented at university. So we're going to look at truly average names. We're going to look at names that are not necessarily most common. We're going to look for common names that are really very average and common names that are really below average. For example, one of the interesting things, this is not confirmed, that's why I'm not putting it on the table, is Greg has done some preliminary calculations, but there's some problems with them. But the preliminary calculations show if we look at common names that are severely underrepresented in Moscow State 1910, they're like 10 or 12% of their true population representation. So they're 1/10 representation. They're moving up to only 0.75 today, which means that would support, if you calculate that, it looks like US and UK too, because there should be symmetry. If true full mobility would have the elite converging and the bottom converging. But it seems the bottom don't fully converge. Using the bottom calculations, we're getting numbers more like UK and US also. But notice what is the potentially good thing about this. General research for further work. Like I sort of said, we want to look more carefully. If we look at MSU, we get a persistence rate on the order of 0.6, and also from chess, we get about 0.67. So we get a persistence rate that is lower than we're getting for US and UK, but still not perfect convergence. Like I sort of said, we have some problems for 41 to 95. We're going to look at this data. And if you look at what's happening with MSU, there's no restoration of the old elite in the top schools today. Looking just at names, HSE seems more elite than Moscow State. HSE has higher USE scores, has more ski names, more German Jewish names, and more elite names than Moscow State in the overall student body, which would be consistent with the fact that HSE is also, by USE scores, ranked higher than Moscow State today in terms of the averages. And we're trying to look for new samples and approach the Census Bureau to try to get more data on the general population. Other potential elite data, Nobelists, Duma, we'll use of generals and colonels in Imperial Russia. Maybe we're going to look at graduates of the elite secondary schools, the elite high schools in Russia in the 19th century where the elite sent their kids. So that may be more elite than, say, the university, because after they graduate from that high school, some go to the military, some go to university, some are self-trained, or et cetera. As I sort of said, we're going to use Wikipedia for some of this. Anyway, that's what we're doing. Any suggestions welcome. Thank you very much. Questions?
Clearly, how you cluster surnames, it's crucial. And I was wondering whether it is possible to associate different surnames with different geographical areas. So for
Yes,
instance,
we're going
in
to
Italy, I could tell you where someone comes from. So
We
that
are
to me
doing
would be-
that. That's why we're collecting the outside Moscow contacted data. Once we have 2 or 3 million names from outside, we can look at, for example, one group that tends to be overrepresented in Moscow State today are names Yan. So Armenian names tend to be overrepresented in Moscow State today. But Armenians are not represented very heavily in the early period. So that would be an interesting case. But the problem is that you can't get mobility then, right? You just have a group that's high now. We want something that's changing over time. That's the issue. But yes, but what we will do, here's what we're going to use. We have a study with Maria Yudkevich and Anna Panova looking at what happened to HSC after the introduction of the USE scores. We haven't been able to get consistent data, but the evidence, at least based upon enrollment, is that the change to USE scores only increased non-Moscow enrollment in HSC a little bit. But we're going to use names to sort of see how geographic distribution is affected. So we're going to look at names that are common outside Moscow, but rare in Moscow, increasing at HSC. So that's one way to get at say, the impact. So that's an example of something for Victor that we didn't have data before, but using this technique, we can get some idea of whether HSC is successfully broadening their admissions, you see. So if we can get names that are, say, associated with southern or far eastern Russia that are not common in western Russia, then, and they go up in percentage in representation in HSC, then we have some evidence of this as well. So we will look at, there are things like it. And like I sort of said, our goal is to look at lists of names. Very often what we do is we're going to rank, what we're doing now, we're not finished, is we're, say, looking at the USE scores. We're clustering the top 10% of all scorers and the bottom 10%. Then we're going to look at all names that are at least 5 times overrepresented in the top 10%. And then we will use that and overlap it with the second group. So it'll be 1911 to 1913. And then we will use that to overlap with 14 to 16. See, using one sample includes a lot of random error. But using 2 samples eliminates a lot of the random error, so it's a more precise estimate of which are the elite groups. And then we will compare that with like Wikipedia and other things of that sort. And similarly for the bottom group. Right? There are some names that are heavily represented both in the top and the bottom. And remember, the bottom of USC scores are not the bottom of Russia, because they're still going to post-secondary education. But still, it's interesting. There are certain groups that are, say, heavily overrepresented in the top 10 of YG, but are not at all in the bottom 10%. And whereas there's some, it's fairly symmetric. So again, we can look at some of these things.
Shivani, does reservation have an effect? Because in India, when we go on to college after school, there's a reservation made for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and there's a general quota. So when you fill out your form, you highlight which category you belong to, and accordingly whether you'll get a place or not. So I can be a 90%er, but belonging to general category, and there could be a 70%er belonging to scheduled caste who gets admission to the elite college and I don't.
So let me answer that very quickly. One is that you have this in the US with respect to, say, blacks too. Blacks with lower scores than Asians are more likely to get in. So for example, somebody did a study for Duke or something where Asians who have almost no chance to enter with a certain score, if they are black with the same test score, they're 99% probable to be entered, because of the distinction between Asian Americans and blacks. The interesting thing for India is, of course, that reservation system helps the non-elites. But interestingly enough, of all the countries Greg studied, the one with the least social mobility is India, which is not surprising because India has an actual caste system. So caste systems will lead to persistence at a higher level than any other country, despite all the things. But that's not a big surprise, because you actually have a formal method of status preservation that no other country has. No other country has anything even vaguely close to the Indian caste system going back hundreds of years, right? So that's not a surprise. The surprise to me is that so far we're finding somewhat higher mobility for Russia than other countries. So another way of sort of saying it, if you have a giant revolution, 2 wars, you get invaded, and if you have somebody like Stalin kill a few million people, you can get social mobility. Not exactly a strong policy proposal. Yes,
I have a like a comment, like a question. So.
go ahead.
So after the revolution, a lot of noble families, they left the country. So that's why they didn't compete in the market. So it can be the case that they were just naturally replaced by the other families. And if they didn't leave the country but stayed here, they would be still overrepresented in the in the society.
Like I said, we don't try to explain why something is the case. We're just trying to figure out the facts first. Remember, China had the same issue. Many of the elites left. After all, a huge fraction of, the Chinese set up a separate government in Taiwan. Many went to Hong Kong. Many went to the United States. And yet, the Cultural Revolution did not affect the overall persistence in Beijing University. So one of the things we want to see is that how much is, say, Russia like China? And our preliminary findings is Russia is more mobile than China. Why it's mobile is it that people left, did people change their names? For example, many people with German names changed their names to Russian names after World War II. And then also some people with Jewish names took their mother's names. A very famous example is the chess player Kasparov. He's actually Weinstein, right? His father's name is Weinstein, but he took his mother's name, Kasparova, hoping to sort of hide his Jewishness. I guess he thought he would rise faster in the chess world. So that's an example. He would be coded as an ov, not as a stein. But that's a reason why you have the thing fall. But what we want to discuss is, despite these things, think about Sweden. There's a lot of out-migration. There's a huge group that moves to the United States. There's a lot of mobility of the elites in Europe. Smart Swedes can study everywhere. And yet, the Swedish overrepresentation is very high. You see this with individual families, by the way. Greg Clark points out that I think Darwin only has 27 living great-grandchildren. They are all extremely accomplished. They are like doctors, lawyers, several writers, actors. How many people saw the first Narnia movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? In the Chronicles of Narnia, you saw this movie, right? Well, there's a little boy there, Edwin, right? Edwin is the great-grandson of Charles Darwin, but he is also related to the great scientist Julian Huxley, the great scientist and writer Aldous Huxley, and John Maynard Keynes. So that's which I consider to be probably a pretty good family pedigree. Right? One of English great writers, great scientists, several of great scientists, and Keynes. Which is, so you have, there's this kind of persistence in some of these families that's really astonishing. And in other cases, what Greg has found, in certain families that were considered non-noble, that rose up, say in House of Commons, when you dug deeper, you found out that they were the bastard child of this person who come this, and etc. It's amazing. Similarly, with Italy, I think there's preliminary evidence of people related to cardinals and popes who had many wives and so forth. And of course, the most extreme case is China, where by some calculations, 1/3 of all Chinese have the Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan genes floating. The one estimate is something like 30% of all Chinese have the Khan family genes when they've done these genetic tests of Orientals. So you can Google this. It's sort of like Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan genes in China or something like that. So some ridiculous fraction of Chinese today have some distant relation to the Khan family.
So, John, thank you for your presentation. It was really the most interesting study I have ever listened to.
Thank you, Victor.
Really, absolutely. Yeah. It's a little bit a personal story for me because my grandmother has the surname. So do you look at male surnames or
We just look at all the surnames
all
which
the so
which
then
people.
ski maybe Skaya.
Exactly. Okay, we include that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
we,
I didn't
We
see-
do call it ski skya.
Yeah.
We
And so-
correct for women. Yeah.
So I think that 20th century was a century of social tragedies in Russia. It was a revolution, civil war,
Yes,
it was Second World War,
Right.
collapse of Soviet Union.
Exactly.
There were a lot of waves of migration.
Correct.
And this is why we can see this that higher amount of social mobility in Russia. But also, there was another moment with Soviet leaders. For instance, when Stalin came to the power, there were a lot of Georgian representatives in the Russian elites. And we can see now even a lot of doctors, surgeons are having Georgian surnames.
But you don't see very strong persistence of Georgians in general.
Yeah,
That's
but
what.
the same after there were some Ukrainian elites. And also when you say that ski is only Polish and Ukrainian, it's also Belarusian.
Okay, sure.
Because my grandmother were from Belarus, and there were another mechanism. There was a distribution. So when you, for instance, my grandmother finished St. Petersburg University. Now it is ITMO University, and she was distributed to Omsk, to Siberia, and it takes 3 generations for me to come. So, and it's so it was not questions, it was comments, and I find your research really.
But you see this all over the world. So for example, in Hong Kong is primarily Cantonese originally. But if you look at a lot of the elite families, like the banks, they're Shanghainese. It's a small fraction, right? So there's like Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. And so a very large fraction of the financial elite of Hong Kong is Shanghainese, even though they're a tiny part of the population.
And also, ski can be a Jewish surname.
Sure,
As-
sure, I understand.
Because each is a Jewish peasants or like.
Like I said, that's why you shouldn't think about the specifics of
Yeah.
who is. You just think about, is it overrepresented? Think about it another way. The more noise you add, the more it will simply converge to the mean. That's why the interesting thing is the ones where it doesn't converge, even with all the noise, even despite all immigration. I mean, like I said, look at those Jewish German names in Moscow State or the USE scores, right? How strange is it that those who are overrepresented in 1885 and 1910 still have substantially high YEGE scores? It's really amazing if you think about it. And moreover, if you look at the minimum is substantially higher than the minimum of the general population. So that's some of the stuff we want to look at.
When we had the mandatory military service in Italy, it comes out that people from elite, they went to this mandatory military service, but they used not to be a normal soldier, but they got a higher position in this hierarchy. Could you do something to control for this elite having data on military service in Russia and see who is in higher position, not a normal soldier?
Well, that's what I said. We're going to collect data on generals, and there's a list of all generals in the Imperial Army for the years before World War I,
Okay.
and we have lists of all the polkovnik, colonels and above also, which we'll collect. So we'll either have a large sample or nearly complete of colonels and a complete list of all Russian generals for the Imperial Army.
And similarly, so I didn't get this precisely the point, so sorry. And similarly, could you do something about the church?
It's harder. I'm not quite sure how we find church data. What we are going to look at is the opposite. We're going to try to look at persecuted religious minorities who've done well. So I have a separate paper with Olga Vasilyeva now, where a group that I'm told that Malia Yudkevich didn't even hear about. There was a small Protestant group called the Molokhans who were persecuted throughout early Russia. The Russian government forced them out of the cities, often punished them, often imprisoned them, did not allow them to live near city centers, and they are among the first groups to emigrate to the Russian Far East. After 1860, when the Russian Far East became part of Russia, they had these empty lands, and we have farm level and district level data for those areas, and we know who settled them, and we know their literacy, and we can look at the Molokhans, and we can do a kind of Acemoglu persistence, because we have farm level data today, corporate farms, and we can say that the areas that were settled by the Molokhans have higher productivity today than all the Russian groups that were Russians that settled them, or Kazakhs. But the interesting thing about this, unlike the Milisadel story or the other Acemoglu stuff, is the Molokhans disappeared. Most went abroad, moved to other areas, or converted back to Russian Orthodox. And yet the areas that were initially settled by Molokhans still have higher average agricultural productivity today. And it's correlated more, the interesting thing is it's only weakly correlated to male human capital literacy. It turns out the big difference between Russian Orthodox and Molokhan is Molokhans, like many Catholic and Protestant groups, educated their women. Russian Orthodox did not educate their women. So the success of these areas are more tied to women literacy than men literacy. Now we are trying to figure out what the mechanism is of persistence. It might be cultural, like we're going to calculate things like how many people, what's happened to alcoholism, that kind of thing, and other kinds of cultural effects that religion might affect this. And by the way, this persistence is true even correcting for test scores. So it's not modern human capital. So even correcting for modern test scores, the areas settled by Molokhans have higher productivity than the areas not. So you see, it's not true that Russia has no data. Russia has many, many interesting data sets. You just have to know how to use them.
Just now you mentioned several times the case in China, but I'm not sure if we can apply the same methodology in China, because considering in China we don't, as far as I know, we don't have the historical tradition of elite names.
That's not the point about the tradition. You misunderstand again. The issue is not whether they're elite. The issue is whether some names are overrepresented. That's all you need.
Yes, for example, the definition of elite in China has changed over time.
That's why I said, don't worry about that. It's not whether they're elite by Chinese definition, just like the definition of elite in Russia changed. Don't think about elite, just think about overrepresentation. Imagine that there's some tribe with a strange Chinese name, which were not elite socially, but just turned out to be 10 times overrepresented at Beijing University 100 years ago. If that tribe is still overrepresented today, there's persistence. So like I said, at the beginning of my talk, it's easier for you to understand this if you don't think about the word elite, but think about overrepresentation. That's how this works.
Yeah, but I'm curious because the way to get enrolled in the Beijing University changed over time.
Yes, but the change over time should destroy persistence. It should be adding noise. But if you have persistence that's statistically significant, that looks just like Oxford and Cambridge, that's not random anymore. That's exactly the point, Xiong.
So I mean, is it possible that it's just normally distributed like inside the university and outside the university?
Which it is possible, but it's not what happens. Greg has studied this, and he's doing more studies in China. That's exactly the point, right? You expect this.
It's very curious.
Every example you give is a reason why we should find no effect. But the fact that despite all these things, you find the big effect, it's amazing, right?
Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay. Well, Peter Bentley.
Of course I know
mean,
Peter, yeah.
Sadly, I'm not descendant of the Bentley Motor Company or Rolls-Royce.
You sure?
Not as far as I'm aware. Maybe it's helped me with my academic career to have that name. Unfortunately, someone else has, Peter Bentley. Peter J. Bentley, there's a prolific publisher, so I have to get creative with my name. Look, obviously it's a very interesting presentation. And social mobility, there's a lot of policy implications aiming towards increasing social mobility. Right. What would you expect to be the policy implications that would come out of your research?
Well, I'm not sure, but here's one. Forget about mine for the moment. Let's say you just talk about Greg Clark's work. Let's assume you show that Russia has more social mobility due to these upheavals. One way to say it is that there are pressures in all societies for elites to maintain their eliteness, regardless of what the rule changes are. Or it takes enormously inhuman changes, like mass murder and war and immigration to change that. If that's true, then it matters very much how the society channels elite status. So for example, if eliteness is rewarded in the form of, say, entrepreneurship, then elites will go into entrepreneurship, which will produce more output for society. If elites are rewarded purely for something nominal, just think about it this way. If elites were told that the only thing to do is, I don't know, is like shoot basketballs, and that's how everything were decided, jobs, everything, then elites would be very good at shooting basketballs, but it wouldn't be very good for society. So one way to think about it is that there's two things. You can have compensatory motions to help people who are non-elite, but you should also think about the fact that given that the elite will make efforts to game whatever the system is, it helps to create rules that encourage them to channel their energies in productive ways for the society. Right? In the same way that, for example, think about rich Americans. Part of the status contest now is donation, charity. Other countries don't quite have this competition. So Americans who are very rich consider it high status to give away most of your money. So Bill Gates has already earmarked 95% of his money will be given away. I think only 5% will be for it. In contrast to other countries like China, which believe in family preservation. And so if you think about, that's like a natural churn that's far stronger than almost the tax rules. Right? Gates has already given away a bigger part of Microsoft than most people would have paid in taxes. And that's partly because of elite status competition. So but it's a weak, at this point, for me to make strong policy recommendations is wrong, for the simple reason that if you believe this, everything we've been taught about social mobility is wrong. Whether or not this turns out to be true is going to be a major issue. But if this work turns out to be true, this is a dramatically different way of thinking about social mobility than anyone has done before. And I do believe Greg Clark deserves all the kudos for doing this. And there are a lot of people who attack him for this work, because even he suggests that genetics might play. He actually told me he lost a huge grant because somebody was upset that he put genetics as a possible mechanism, which seems idiotic since, of course, it has to be one of the mechanisms. It's not the only one, but to assume that genetics have no effect on this is just stupid. I'm sorry. It's just like, yeah.
I have two real questions.
Yeah, sure.
Not suggestions, but questions. One question is, does it make any sense, according to use the first names too, in that sense that some first names, like Rebecca, Gabriel, Ralph, have very clear connotations with a certain descent, and it would solve your problem of girls taking the name of the husband. And so if you just run Rebecca and Gabriel on your set, and if they're overrepresented, I think that would be a great result. And the second question is, maybe the definition of status changes over time. I would imagine that while in the past status was being in elite university, maybe today status is also just being a good entrepreneur, oligarch, or being rich. So, and I'm sure you can find lists of rich businessmen,
Sure.
And if you would look at overrepresentation there, my impression is you would find a pretty striking result, probably more striking than with the US scores.
Well, that's actually the Greg's point, right? That is to say, once you look at different measures of eliteness, somehow whatever the current measures of eliteness are, the elites are there. And that's why we want to look at these different things. And with respect to first names, we've thought about, I'm not going to get into it here, but first names require, there's a whole different set of issues involved in first names. And I don't want to discuss it here because that's a very long project. It's a very different issue. And like I sort of said, there's so much gold, I think, to be mined just on surnames that let's make sure we're right, right? I mean, I want to be really careful. And the good thing about this is that if we're really careful, this is one of those rare studies where literally it doesn't matter what I find. If I find low social mobility, then Russia looks like other countries. If I find high social mobility, then we need to understand why you have a higher, etc. You see, if we find high social mobility for some groups but not others, can we also understand why you have high social mobility for some groups? And the really cool thing about this, even though it's imperfect, it is objective in a way that other methods are not. It does not require prejudging who is elite. We are trying to guess at what are elite things, but in the end, it's representation that determines elite overness, not whether somebody called them an elite or not, which is, again, an objective aspect which we want to think about how these things work.
The social mobility is slow because now, like we have.
So low?
Yeah, so slow.
So slow, okay, yeah.
Because now, like we have like free education, we have scholarship system, so many people can be entered like to the elite. So why still the social mobility is so slow?
You mean in like the US or UK
Yeah.
or Sweden? I think for two reasons. One is that families can still do things more than this, such as, for example, in America, families can pay for extra training for your kids. Family social behavior. If you look, for example, why do Asian Americans do so well in America in school? Because Asians value education. They've done studies that show very poor Asians still insist on education. They will save up, they will wear old clothes, they will drive ugly cars, but they will make sure their child goes to the best school they can go to. In contrast, there have been studies that show that other minorities like Latinos and blacks care more about, like, say, having expensive tennis shoes than about going to schooling. Asians also have a much higher saving rate. You especially see this even correcting for IQ. So for example, two groups, the Asian group, which has below average IQ, are actually Filipinos. So Filipinos are below US average IQ. And they're very similar in measured IQ to Mexicans. But if you compare Mexicans and Filipinos, Filipinos have much higher rates of completing college, much lower rates of unemployment, much lower rates of prison, much lower out-of-wedlock birth. So a lot of the cultural dimensions, Filipinos do very well, whereas Mexicans tend not to do very well. So in fact, with Mexicans, it's interesting that first-generation immigrants tend to have lower crime than the second-generation Mexicans. So second-generation and third-generation Mexicans do not converge to the US mean. They end up somewhere between the black mean and the white mean. Asians, on the other hand, converge to above the American mean. A very good example of that is that imagine an Acemoglu paper that said, like, imagine some group comes to a country and suffers racial discrimination. The people are taken from their homes, they're discriminated against, their homes are confiscated, they lose their jobs. When they get back their homes, some of them lost their homes, many of them lost their jobs, and they lost a great deal of money and suffered from continual racial discrimination. If I said to you, one generation later, it's not a surprise if that group does poorly, right? Except that group are Japanese Americans, who one generation after World War II, despite suffering discrimination, going into concentration camps, and often losing their homes and their jobs, actually earned more and have higher test scores than the average white American just 25 years after World War II. So that's a very big difference. Some groups, somehow, something bad that happened 400 years ago persists. In other groups, in one generation, all the negative effects are wiped out. So it's a very interesting story to understand. That's one. The second one, which we cannot deny, is there must be some genetic effects. And this is not very politically correct, but there's a lot of work that shows the genetics, and this is one of the things I want to do. Genetics matters more than people think. So just to give you two examples, there's a famous paper by Sacerdote, who's been mentioned before. He does a lot of education research. Sacerdote has a paper in the American Economic Review, I think, or QJ, one of the two, one of the top journals, in looking at Korean adoptees. And here's the amazing thing. A lot of people have looked at adoption, but what Sacerdote did is unusual. He looked at Korean adoptees to the United States after the Korean War. These are babies, basically, and these are unwanted babies in Korea. So it's not like these are rich kids or whatnot, who were adopted by Americans. But what's interesting is that he studied American families who also had white children. So they had biological children. So these Korean babies grew up with white foster brothers and sisters, okay? Now, these families were distributed in income from below average income to very wealthy. I think the highest group had over 100,000 a year in the 50s, right? That's people making a couple $1 million a year in today's money. So the group was very huge distribution of income. He followed these groups over 40 or 50 years. The white children's lifetime income was highly correlated to the parents' income. The Korean kids' correlation was 0. I think the actual correlation was below 0.1 and was not statistically significant. So not just it wasn't significant, the point estimate was close to 0. So in other words, it didn't matter whether the Korean kid was adopted by a millionaire family or a below average income family. there was no effect on average on their income, which is astonishingly high straight result. Similarly, if you look at many Asian groups, they'll say, well, poverty has a big effect on performance. But if you look at the bottom 20% of Asian families in California, the math test scores of their children are higher than the math test scores of all the blacks in Princeton, New Jersey. Not the university, the area, which is one of the richest areas in the United States. Those black families who earn over 100,000 a year on average, their kids have lower test scores than the bottom 20% of the poorest Asians who don't even speak English when they come to America. So again, these are strong cultural effects, which are very important as well. So if you think about those two combining, you can sort of see why these things get there. I mean, there's a lot of, I was thinking about Australia when you asked me a question, Peter. I remember reading a factoid which I was shocked by, because I was studying physics. And I'm older, so people probably won't know who Olivia Newton-John is. But she was a very famous pop singer who did Grease with John Travolta and whatnot. It turns out she's the granddaughter of Max Born, the Nobel Prize winner in physics. And I think Max Born's daughter had a fight with him, left, moved to Australia, got married, and the daughter grows up to be like one of the highest earning pop singers in history. So you see these kinds of persistence. They're not always in the same area, but you see these persistence across various lines that are not surprising. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.